Welcome to the New Jersey Amistad Curriculum Podcast, the show where we explore the resources and best practices for teaching African and African American history in the K-12 curriculum in New Jersey. We aim to highlight outstanding educational practitioners and their strategies and challenges in meeting the Amistad mandate. I'm your host, Dr. J.T. Mills, a member of the New Jersey Amistad Commission. In this edition of the Amistad Podcast, we will discuss the role of Black history in the K-12 curriculum and offer insight into curriculum development to better align with the mandate and culturally relevant pedagogy. In this first segment, African American or Black history has been branded by some as anti-intellectual, a divisive curriculum, a critique as being un-American or inconsequential to the educational process. In Florida, legislation was recently passed to suppress advanced placement African American studies, claiming that the content is an indoctrination rather than an academic inquiry. This marginalization of knowledge is essentially one of the tools for preserving a white-centric historical narrative for the origins of this country, and therefore is an intentional suppression of African and African American, as well as other non-white people's contributions for this nation's prosperity in the world. Today, we will hear from Ismael Jimenez, an educator from Philadelphia with 2 decades of experience in teaching, coaching, and developing content related to Black studies. Along with working with students from elementary age to post-secondary, Ismael has conducted various professional developments around the integration of Black studies nationally with several school districts and universities. The focus of Ismael's work centers on curriculum development and pedagogical orientation through a Black studies lens. With that said, I would like to introduce Ismael Jimenez to the show. And did I say your name right?
Well, I say Ismael Jimenez, but
Okay,
it's all good.
all right. And so, Ismael, just kick things off, how do you describe the role of Black history in K-12 education?
I think Black history plays a fundamental role when we're talking about making sense and contextualizing the reality of American society. Not only does it give a counter narrative to kind of the mythological storytelling that this society tells itself sometimes, but it also kind of holds it up to a mirror, an honest mirror, where we can follow a track of folks who humanity was not affirmed from the founding of the society, and their fight to really be affirmed, which actually those benefits and those victories not only came to Black people, but all people of all races. And we can see this through line throughout history. So a steady, real look at Black history is the only way, quite frankly, that I believe folks can wrap their head around the complexity of American society.
Very good. And with that, then how do you feel about the challenges and critiques that I just really described in the introduction?
Yeah, I find them extremely problematic, and it kind of shows the entrenchment that Eurocentric narratives play, and also the mythologies in which I described earlier. Throughout American history, there has been many progressions, but also many, many more regressions when it comes to actually speaking honestly about topics associated with Black people, with Black studies, with Black history. We got to not forget the fact that the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, in 1933, was talking about the need to really have a Black History Week to celebrate, because most of that history was kept out of the books. We also have examples in the Jim Crow South where teachers would have Carter G. Woodson's book and keep it on their lap and teach the children the truth and complexity about U.S. history. So when I hear about these attacks, I view it more as a continuity with how this society has really avoided reconciling kind of its original sin. And then we have peaks of progress, right? The Black Studies movement in the late 60s, early 70s, right, which gave way to universities having the first Black Studies degrees and focused content, and school districts like the Philadelphia School District, which required African American history for graduation in 2005. We cannot forget that Florida even has a Black history mandate since the 1980s. So when you look at all this, you see these victories pop up, but it's presented to folks in the real time as kind of something that's controversial or indoctrinating. But I would say leaving it out is a form of indoctrination. So the fact that folks don't know certain things, don't know Carter G. Woodson is the father of Black history that started Negro History Week, which became Black History Month. That's a form of indoctrination.
Mm.
And we need to speak honestly about how these things are framed, or we're just talking in circles and making the same arguments that our ancestors continued to make.
With that, how so? You sort of spoke to it a little bit, but maybe expound a little bit on why is Black history foundational to understanding U.S. and world history?
Well, the modern world economic system was produced by the forced labor of enslaved Africans, not just here in the United States of America, but also we're talking about the Caribbean, we're talking about South America, we're also talking about the role that it played in the development of Europe
Mm.
and the wealth generated from that, and then the eventual colonization of the African continent and other places in Asia. So when you look at this, the wealth that was acquired and obtained from the enslavement of Africans actually allowed Europe, who actually lagged behind country, not countries, but places in Africa and places in Asia before the slave trade,
Mm.
actually allowed them to colonize the world and really institute a system based on putting, Africans and their descendants at the bottom rung of the economic order, the social order, the psychological order, and they shaped societies and understandings and narratives around that. So it's very hard to make sense of, Thomas Jefferson writing "All men are created equal," and then ignore the fact that he had children with his dead wife's half sister, who was an enslaved girl
Hmm.
that he owned. That's a reality, y'all. And I feel like when these stories are left out, we lose the complexity, the human nature, the interactions of folks throughout time. And that's really how we can get to the crux of a lot of the societal, disputes and divisions that exist within this society if we take an honest look. And also by taking an honest look, we can actually think of how can we improve, how can we move forward, right? How can we actually think of a better way of orienting ourselves in the world amongst each other, and also around wealth. And I think that is right there, like it just becomes like a whole storyline, whether we're talking about reparations, whether we're talking about, the role of continued economic exploitation of folks around the world who are descendants of Africans. And you just see this as a steady stream. So I would argue if folks don't know that, then you have been indoctrinated, and you have been indoctrinated with anti-blackness. Regardless if you're black, white, purple with pink polka dots. I believe that it's fundamental to understand humanity and where we're at today. And Black history, for me, is really the only vehicle that gets you to the point where you can actually look at it honestly.
Thank you. Very good. And so, one of the challenges I guess that's always out there when it comes to education and educators is how can teachers effectively teach this content across grade levels?
Well, and see, becomes an interesting question because in most teacher preparation programs, teachers are trained in this traditional framework type of way. And when I say traditional framework way, it's like you give a test, you have an objective,
Hmm.
there's some activities that the students do. But I think through a Black Studies lens and pedagogical strategies, you start shifting from simply having classroom management to building a community with your students within the classroom. That is only framed through a Black Studies lens. Scholars like Asa Hillard, Jacob Carruthers, Dr. LeGarrette King, all have kind of pinpointed the intersection of not only the content, but also the way it's taught, the relationship focus of the teachers with the students, the collective learning and shared experiences that the teacher creates for the students in the class to kind of get to conclusions and wrestle with ideas. And I think when you look at it through that lens, the Black Studies lens actually illuminates another way of thinking of curriculum development, where not only are you talking about Black history and Black people, but you're actually thinking of how to look through the lens of these scholars, of this intellectual genealogy, which really has produced some of the most deep thinking type of situations, whether you're talking about from the continent or you're even talking about across the diaspora. You start to get into the question of, okay, here's the objective. This is what we're trying to get to in a class. But then through the activities, through those shared learning experiences, you're actually coming to a goal of authentically having an assessment where students actually interact with the world in real terms and practice out their theories in practice. Whether that is, students looking at reparations policies across the United States and coming up with a policy brief and then sharing that policy brief with their local city council. Whether that is, students organizing, historical studies on a certain unknown aspect of Black history to have a historical marker placed at a certain location. All these type of ideas really engage the students in a different type of way. And it doesn't simply have to be confined about talking about Black history, right? This becomes generative, but it's through the Black Studies lens when we start to look at education less as this boxed discipline and much more in a wider scope, really off the traditional Africana way of thinking. When you look at the ancient Kemet, when you look at how subjects are studied across the continent. And even how people interact and learn overall. We cannot forget George Washington Carver was not only a scientist, but a mathematician. He also, read a lot. He was also an inventor, and he looked at it differently. That's the way to think of it, and that's the type of tools and skills that we should be emphasizing to teach our children. So when I argue to do it through a Black Studies lens, I'm less talking about the specific content going, but the way we approach simply how the classroom's organized, how the relationships within the classroom are structured, and then how the overall curriculum is thought of and developed through planning of the teacher, and then thinking ahead about how all the pieces are interconnected, involving multiple disciplines all at once.
So that's one of the things, certainly, I think the New Jersey mandate talks about. Can you speak to maybe a subject matter or something specific in history that might demonstrate for, let's say, a pre-service or a teacher that they could construct a lesson from?
Well, there's multiple things. George Washington Carver, who I just mentioned, with what he did with the peanut. And no, he did not invent peanut butter, y'all. Um, there's a little misnomer with that. But like even looking at his techniques and his organization and his relationship with Henry Ford, there are some folks that say Henry Ford got the idea of, the assembly line at the plant from the way George Washington Carver described the development of the seeds within a plant, and which is just a really crazy idea. But we want students to be exposed to this, not just in a social studies class, but thinking about how, in a math class, potentially even a science class, when you're talking about the studying of plants and biology and all the intersections. Another example, I would say, is math. When we talking about the African diaspora across the world, right? Americans, in the United States, we're very, for lack of a better idea, self-centered about our centrality in the world. But when you actually look at it, there were more people of African descent sent to Brazil. So one way, when I used to teach this about, the African diaspora, I used to tell my students, well, there's more people of African descent on this side of the world that speak Portuguese than English. And then I would ask them, do you know anybody that speaks Portuguese, right? And it's real interesting over time when I started to get some students from Brazil, they would say yes. But it also speaks to kind of how do we look at these numbers? How do we calculate the total human cost of the Ma'afa of Africans across the Atlantic. And we cannot forget that also the months even taken to the shoreline of the coast of Africa. And then what mathematical equations could we guesstimate of the total human cost? Because we cannot forget, even when folks landed here, there was a high death rate, right? I believe 50% of children born to enslaved women in certain places didn't live past the age of 5. And this type of life expectancy, in Haiti, right? The average life expectancy of an African coming there was 3 years. They just made so much money off of it that they would just replace people as they come, which then gets into the idea of even the Africanness of the Haitian Revolution and cultural retention, and then linguistic kind of connections of like how folks even communicated with one another coming from these multiple places. So not to get too much in the weeds with how it relates, but again, over time, when you start really looking at it, you have a hard time differentiating how these different disciplines aren't involved in it. And that is, I would say, a truly a great thing to get to, because then your mind starts opening. You can get into even how, the Spanish decided who was black and who was not, compared to the British, compared to, the French. And it really gets complicated at that point. You can also calculate the amount of years. And right now I'm talking about a lot of math problems. But of course, when you talk about DNA and population dispersion, you start to get into science. And it's so much rich material. You can really look at people's origin stories, because quite frankly, people of African descent, that history of lineage stops at a certain point. And that not having that idea of where you come from is a feeling that too many folks around the world and in the United States know intimately.
So the interconnectedness that I hear you talking about when it comes to disciplines and subject matters that can be woven through the content, and so I guess what you, in layman's term, you're talking about the pedagogy that can be constructed, that can building blocks.
Yeah,
Building blocks
exactly.
from K to throughout the entire formative years of education, and subject matters that can be aligned to the different areas that people want to teach. What drove you, or has driven you to be such a advocate of this of African American history and Black history?
Well, not to go too far back, but in fourth grade, I was going to a majority white school, and I used to have a stuttering problem. And I rose my hand one day to answer a question, and I started stuttering. And the class laughed at me. And the teacher said to the class, "Oh, don't mind him. His people talk like that." Already at the point, my mother was, a Black woman who grew up in Liverpool. So she talked about her experience being the only Black girl on her block her whole life. And so I told my parents, the teacher apologized. But a woman, the librarian at the school, this older Jewish woman, gave me her original copy of the autobiography of Malcolm X in fourth grade. So I read that in fourth grade. By fifth grade, kids were calling me Ishmael X. And so that shaped my thinking when it comes to Black history. So after I read that book several times, mind you, at a young age, I had a thirst to read any biography, any autobiography, any type of slice of wisdom from folks that I could find. And I also find it ironic that I never even heard about Carter G. Woodson until my mid-20s, even though I loved Black history from a young age. So around 16, after really not performing that well traditionally at school, I found out that I loved education. I love to read. I love to talk about these things. I love to like watch McLaughlin Group on Sundays if I'm not dating myself too much. At like 13 years old, and at 16, in the social studies class, I just realized this is what I want to do. I want to talk about. I want to teach about what I know, and I want to learn more. So from that point forward, even though I graduated high school with a 1.6 GPA, I
Mm,
knew that I was going to go to community college, get my associate's degree in secondary education, transfer to Temple University to get my bachelor's degree, and that I was going to teach Black history in Philadelphia, because during that time of going through that process, I found out that the school district of Philadelphia and Philadelphia schools were requiring Black history for graduation. So it was just kind of serendipitous, mixed at the same time with my own passion. Now, going into that for over 12 years, I taught that subject as a
mhm,
requirement. First to in a majority Black school, and then moving over for the last 8 years in the classroom to a school that was very diverse racially and ethnically, but not socioeconomically.
mhm.
So I had to kind of adjust. At the other school, I was preaching to the choir. At this school, I had to develop, how do I teach these complex, nuanced ideas to folks that don't feel like they have any connection, and actually, as our previous we're talking about, were indoctrinated, quite frankly, with some anti-Black sentiments about how people operate and move and how the society is organized.
Mhm.
So going through that process, thinking through, and actually trying to do a good job and learning from my students about how they were processing what they were learning, how they were thinking about the content and subject matter, and then the connections that they made. One of the things, just to go back, that I didn't even mention, how this intersects all the time with literacy. If you're studying Black history and not reading and writing every single day, you're not studying Black history. And then also media literacy, something I think that is becoming so much more important in the modern age, which quite frankly should be taught in every school explicitly, especially with the rise of social media content and kind of the reliance on AI across the board. People are going to have to learn those skills to discern what's real and what's not.
Mm.
And I think, Black history is just one of those perfect examples of, like, this is what they say compared to the reality of what we know within these primary documents. So all those things just coalesced into me really just wanting to write my own curriculum,
Okay.
work with others who are teaching it, also share ideas, participate in book clubs around different content related to African American history, partnering with museums, talking with museum curators and folks at the top of the field, and actually engaging scholars. Like Dr. Hassan Jeffries, scholars like Dr. LeGarrette King and Dr. Greg Carr, folks who have also studied these kind of subjects from the academic sense, and try to figure out how to translate that into much more I don't want to say simpler terms, but much more layman terms
Mhm.
for the average student to grasp and understand, and then eventually for the average teacher who maybe never been exposed to think about it and process their own type of understanding when it comes to how these things should be approached and talked about.
So I think that's a really important aspect of what you just said, ended what you ended that with, and that's the teachers. And so, how do we, or what do you suggest, or some good strategies, or what should be done to assist these future educators? Because we have to be real about it. For the most part, these are young people coming from not so diverse uh, neighborhoods and schools, and quite frankly, I'm not being disparaging in saying this, that the majority or the dominant uh, uh, person that is in this profession are white females,
Mhm.
and they just may not have been exposed to these things, um, and so I always say to myself, or I think, um, you're better at teaching than what you know. And because I've said this to folks before. I mean, if you ask me to teach karate or martial arts, I have that background.
Mm.
You want me to teach your children ice hockey? I've never put on a pair of skates. Now, can I get some YouTube stuff together? Can I read some books? Yes.
Yeah.
But how effective will I really be? I could probably do it, but then some kid's going to ask me to get up on the ice,
Hmm.
and that's not happening. So, what are some things you think are ways that uh, we can help these future educators be better educators?
Well, first, right there, acknowledge that there is a gap. I think sometimes people come into a situation and be like, "Oh, I know what I'm going to do," or "I don't want to touch that because I don't know what I'm doing." And
Mm-hmm.
there's a spectrum in between. So I think exposure. One of the things that I found working closely with educators, with teachers around professional development, is exposing them to the scholars' thinking. Whether that is, incentivizing them to attend, talks. We have a great thing now called virtual, webinars
Mm-hmm.
that are happening all the time around these subjects, and also in place things. I think of Princeton University and at the end of February had a whole symposium on Black studies and the teaching on it and the difficulties and the attacks on it. So it's kind of getting involved in the conversation, bearing your feet. But there's also a lot of, I would say, unlearning that needs to happen,
Mm.
where kind of the myths of that have been indoctrinated into a lot of folks need to be countered, but not countered in a way of saying you're stupid, it's like this, but more countered in a way of like showing them and having them really wrestle with it in professional developments. I think one strategy definitely is within school districts, they need to develop, well, what's our theory of change when it comes to implementing, Amistad and Black history content, right? What do we want to see? And then have those measurements embedded in a professional development series that teachers are required or incentivized to attend, and then have them kind of do pre and post tests around certain kind of perceptions. So you can gauge really what's connecting, what type of questions, what remaining uncomfortabilities. Because one thing I found is most of the time it's not our maliciousness
Right.
that folks don't want to talk about this. I think sometimes it's simply because they just don't know, and some of them have like I said, a whole spectrum. Some of them just feel bad, don't want to touch it with a 1,000-foot pole, and other people lean in to some of the most problematic anti-Black pathologies existent in this society, and we have to talk about that. So teachers should also be engaged in book clubs and read some of the original work that informs the current intellectual genealogy. Schools should have book clubs like reading The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson. Teacher preparation programs should not be talking about simply white pedagogical theorists. They should
Mm-hmm.
involve Asa Hillard. They should talk about W.E.B. Du Bois's concepts of education. You know what I mean? Like, there's no reason folks can go the whole time and only learn about Thomas Mann, John Dewey, and Kavatsky or whatever. I don't remember his name,
Mm-hmm.
Vavzaksky or whatever. But you have to really approach it in a way where you're being honest to yourself. Like, have I learned about any Black scholar that informs what teaching looks like? Do
Mm-hmm.
I know about successful processes that existed with in during Jim Crow, where you had these highly educated Black educators who were educated in places like Columbia, Harvard, with doctorate degrees, who would go back into the communities in which they came from to teach and lead schools and communities with very little resources. There's a strong tradition, and that's another thing. Like, when we talk about American public education, you can't talk about it without Black people. There wouldn't, you know what I mean? The first
Mm-hmm.
public schools in the South were because formerly enslaved people demanded it. When you see, schools even being built in the South, you see black people not only pulling their resources together, but pulling scarce resources together and even helping to build schools within themselves. So that level of self-determination around education can also inform kind of how people are doing. But like, teachers need to know this. They need to know these backgrounds. They need to know this history. And they also need to know kind of like the situation, I mean, the context of what currently exists, where certain districts are less funded than others or under state control. Why are those state controlled districts always in a familiar type of scenarios? How much investment or disinvestment has happened over the last 30 to 40 years? Because really, that's all we're talking about at this point. And, you know, those are the type of things that folks need to really wrestle with to get closer. But I would just start right there. First step, unlearning. Next step, learning and being exposed to scholars in the field and content, being involved in those conversations, and then ongoing professional development that is targeted and looked at through the data, that you're trying to get to a certain point where teachers have a sense of comfortability, and then can also point out where, you know, it becomes problematic. Because I don't care if you are against teaching this or for teaching this, but if you're not wrestling about all the complexity involved, then you're indoctrinating your students, regardless of what side of that spectrum you fall on. And then the question then becomes, what is the purpose of what you're teaching behind this? Are you actually talking about Black people's humanity, affirming through a Black lens when you're talking about this? Or are you just talking about Black people through a white lens, which unfortunately, that's the highest level a lot of people get to, and we have to move past that.
So we have a couple of minutes left. Before I ask you to go into segment 3 here, just give you a moment to think about this next question I have for you. How do we get more African American or Black males involved with becoming educators? So hold that thought, and we're going to come back in just a moment. Welcome back to the New Jersey Amistad Curriculum Podcast. And today we have Mr. Ismael Jimenez here speaking with us. And before we broke, I asked the question, how do we get more African American, or even just men of color, I hate using that term because white is a color, how do we get more males who look like you and I involved in education?
Well, first, I want to highlight the wonderful work in Philadelphia, but also nationally, that Sharif El-Mekki is doing with the Center for Black Educator Development. Not only are they offering programs for high school students to become mentors and assistant counselors in their freedom schools during the summertime for a paid type of internship, but they also are working on CTE programs in high schools, where students can become kind of get a the first step of certification for teaching and experience. I think a lot of Black boys are not placed in a position where they look at school as a humanizing space. Remember, it's a very dehumanizing situation for a lot of folks. So it's like, I don't want to do that. Like, that teaching, that's, the kids are mean. I couldn't do, I've heard it from a lot of folks. But I think just exposing them to the field, kind of giving folks the opportunity with financial incentives, I think that helps a lot on the high school level, to kind of visit schools, to produce lesson plans, to plan with one another, I think can take it a long way. And then, being hooked up with mentors who are already in the field, who check in with them, who process, quite frankly, some of the, micro and macro aggressions that exist, unfortunately, in such spaces, and think through of how folks can really do. Because the research actually shows students who have at least one Black male educator once in their K through 12 education actually have improved chances of going to college, of graduating on time. It's crazy, and it benefits not just Black students, but students of all races, because it also, like I said previously, dismantles and disrupts the anti-black pathology that permeates the society at whole.
Very good. And uh, to close out, what would you like to see, or are there things that you would like to see the Amistad uh, um, mandate or the commission do to bolster their mission?
One thing I would like to see the commission do is potentially start piloting what a required course would look like. A year-round course could make the difference, right? Even if you're just talking about in a few spaces with student support and community support. I think Cherry Hill, New Jersey already has a requirement for graduation. I think that can be used as data
Hmm.
to show the effect, especially if we do some qualitative research looking at how students perceive, where do students advance over the years afterwards who have taken the course, what type of work that they're doing, what kind of careers they pursued. You'd be, I think we would be pleasantly surprised the beneficial effects of effectively teaching this subject, and then use that information to kind of make that argument of strengthening, even if it's not required at a local district,
Hmm.
but the mandate and how the mandate needs to be supported, not just from the top, but also kind of encouraged by teacher leaders in the field. So money dedicated to cultivating kind of those like teacher fellowships, where teachers not only develop curricular resources that other folks can use, but also facilitate professional developments inside their district and in surrounding districts if you are having difficulty.
Hmm.
And just like the students, develop a mentor network where folks meet, uh, once in a while, maybe like quarterly, at meetings and kind of go over kind of like stances and different ideas about what content is actually being seen or observed being done, and what locations, quite frankly, are not touching it with a 10-foot pole. And it's not in a punitive way, but it's in
Hmm.
a way to really just situate the orientation. I think the Amistad Commission can play a pivotal role in kind of uplifting that, especially in a current reality in America. I think New Jersey has done a wonderful job of really holding steadfast on the importance of not just Black history, but Latino history, women's history, even the work around the Holocaust is admirable. And as the rest of as many, unfortunately, many states have actually gone back to kind of saying you can't even say a word associated. Certain other states like New Jersey, Illinois, several others have really leaned into the fact and be like, no, this is important. All of our children need to do it. It's just that the folks like the Amistad Commission, like you, Dr. Mills, you're in a unique position to really, when the rubber hits the road, really make it matter. Like not just on paper, but make it matter in the sense of, folks are being exposed, and folks are being kind of asked to, get out of their comfort zone a little bit, learn some things, and become better people as a result. Because, quite frankly, through this process, you become a better person.
Yeah. And so, thank you for joining us today. Definitely, when it comes to the New Jersey mandates and the other commissions that exist in New Jersey, which now you brought that up, I'm wondering how many other states have the number of commissions that New Jersey has, and so hopefully, we can work to continue building up the mandate, encouraging different school districts to at least engage.
Yeah.
I think if that, I mean, that's the minimal thing we can ask for, I guess, at this point. And it really, I don't see how it takes a lot of energy to do that. Um, so, at minimum, just to engage, because once I think people are exposed to this information and this a new way of thinking, and especially when it comes to kids, I think they're always ready to be able to do that.
I
And
agree 100%.
okay, so again, thank you for joining us. Hopefully, we can connect again at some time here in the future and have you back and discuss some more of this. Thank you. You've been listening to the New Jersey Amistad Commission Curriculum Podcast. Thank you for joining us on today's episode. You can reach the Commission with any questions or inquiries about how you can contribute to this effort to AmistadSP at doe.nj.gov. This is the New Jersey Amistad Podcast, brought to you in partnership with the New Jersey Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, the New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association, the New Jersey Association of School Administrators, the statewide Parent Advocacy Network, the Garden State Coalition of Schools, and the New Jersey Leadership for Educational Excellence.